Right, hello everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to lecture 3 in the politics of religion. In the last 2 lectures, we've been going over some of the, the conceptual issues around the idea of religion, and also looking at some of the theoretical issues involved in how we study religion. And one of the key points that has emerged so far is that definitions of religion have different dimensions and different emphases. So we can, for example, look at religion substantively in terms of the ideas and the beliefs that religions have about the way that reality works. We can look at religion functionally in terms of the practices of its members and the behaviours, things like values and relationships, rituals, things like this. And we can also look at it discursively, viewing religion as an ongoing process. This is a sort of a thing where religion is socially constructed on an ongoing basis rather than an objective, concrete, objective factor of reality. Now I'm going to come back to the discursive view later on in the module, but for the next couple of weeks I'm going to focus a bit more on the substantive and the functional definitions, starting today with the substantive view of religion, which looks at the relationship between religion and science. And this is the plan. So first of all, I'm going to go through the main competing models of the relationship between religion and science, which are generally known as the conflict and the harmony theses, although we're getting to them in obviously more detail. Then I'm going to look at some of the evidence for and against these different perspectives. And then finally, I'm going to look at some of the ways in which debates around religion and science actually impact upon political life, showing that these are not just sort of, abstract debates that academics have, but have real-world consequences to things that affect people all over the globe. And I'm going to focus in particular on the issue of climate change and the pandemic, which everybody would much rather not think about ever again, but it does have some interesting things to say around religion and science. So I'm going to be looking at all of that. Now, one of the most popular ways of describing the links between religion and science was developed by this guy, Ian Barber, and he constructed 4 main models to explain this relationship. And as you can see here, we've got the conflict model, the independence model, the dialogue model, and the synthesis approach. And I'm basically going to follow this model as I go through and explain the different ways in which the two ideas can be put together or not, as the case may be. So the first of these, which is very definitely in the not category, is known as the conflict thesis. And this is no surprise. It's like the name, the clue's in the name, right? This basically says that religion and science are pitted against each other in some kind of fight to the death, right? Like King Kong and Godzilla. Obviously, in this example, Godzilla is science, although probably not all the hollow earth stuff that they had going on. We could sort of leave all that to what? That would be like the conspiracy theory side of things. But this is basically what the theory argues, right? You've got science and religion locked together in this mortal struggle for supremacy, and ultimately one of them has to lose and only one of them can win. And this idea was popularised in the 19th century, in particular by a guy called John William Draper, and another chap called Andrew Dickinson White. And as you can see, they both wrote books on this topic, and the titles are fairly self-evident. History of the warfare of science with theology, and a history of the conflict between religion and science, right? I mean, it's pretty obvious what those books are about. The reason why I'm showing you this is because when you read about this topic, you will sometimes find the conflict thesis referred to as the Draper-White thesis. This is where it comes from. And so the central claim here is that science and religion have fundamentally different ways of gaining knowledge about the world and about understanding how reality works. And those are completely incompatible. right? You cannot find a way of interlocking them together that works. So religion understands the world through revelations from holy texts, for example, or from various other forms of supernatural communication, things like miracles or visions or religious experiences and things like this. So religion comes at reality through the lens of revelation, whereas science comes at reality through processes of observation, devising tests, constructing hypotheses, measuring the results, refining the theory if things don't work out the way in which people imagine. All of this stuff, replicable experiments, all of this stuff under the umbrella of, as you know, the scientific method. So there's two completely contrasting different ways of looking at reality, and they just don't go together, according to this approach. Now, supporters of the conflict thesis, which include the new atheists most popularly, I would guess, and we are going to come on to the new atheists in a few weeks, so we'll be looking at this in a bit more detail. They argue, as you can see in this quote, that the scientific method is completely superior to religion. Religion's not even worth thinking about. Science, if it's a fight between science and religion, it's going to be over before the end of the first round. It's a one-punch knockout. Science completely has the upper hand, and religion is just completely trash and is just the loser on every single occasion. And this is basically how the new atheists will interpret this relationship. And so some common examples of this include, these are probably the most famous ones, so I'm sure you all have heard of them. First of all is the belief in geocentrism, which was the view that the Earth went round the sun. No, it's the other way around, sorry. completely cocked this up. I'll probably go and edit this out later on. This was the view that the Earth was the centre of the universe. And this was the view of the Christian Church until, initially Nicholas Copernicus, who was a Polish astronomer, came up with the hypothesis that actually it was the other way round. And then most famously, as I'm sure you've all heard of, Galileo in 1632, who produced observational evidence to demonstrate that the geocentric worldview was completely wrong, and was famously put under house arrest for his troubles. Just on that particular point, by the way, because this is the sort of famous narrative, right? Galileo with his telescopes proving that the Catholic Church had got it wrong, and the Catholic Church didn't. They refused even to look through the telescope. He was trying to show them, and they said, no, we don't even want to know. By the way, go in your house and don't come out. It wasn't quite like that. Yes, it's true he was under house arrest, but it wasn't just because of this. He also wrote several rude things about the Pope, which in that particular social climate was not the cleverest thing to do. So he'd already rubbed a few people up the wrong way before this even happened. But nevertheless, this is a very famous example. Another one is, of course, the view that the Earth is only a few thousand years old, which is very popular amongst young Earth creationists in Christianity and Islam, but this was also the view of the Christian Church until it was disproven during the 18th century by, there was a couple of geologists in particular who proposed models and went out and gained geological evidence about how the Earth actually worked and how the Earth's crust kind of moved around and all these kinds of things. James Hutton and Sir Charles Lyell, which again demonstrated that the Earth was a little bit older than a few thousand years. So again, in this case, we have science winning. And we also have, which is the most famous one of all, completely rebuffing the claim that human beings were directly created by God. According to the conflict thesis, this was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. One thing, again, just to maybe sort of say on this point, it sometimes comes up in these debates that Darwin proved that the divine origins of life were false. That's not quite the case. Darwin had absolutely nothing to say about how life began. The theory of evolution is not a theory of how life starts off. That is called, if I can pronounce it properly, autopoiesis, or something like this, autopoiesis. I think that's it, autopoiesis. That's the process. The theory of evolution is about what happens once that process has started, and then how life goes through various different stages. But anyway, this was the view of Darwin, demonstrating the principles of natural selection. And then finally, we have another thing which comes up in these science and religion debates, which is that this idea of the God of the gaps, which you may run into. And the claim here is that as science develops and as it explains increasingly more things, in reality, the sphere that religion has for its explanations become increasingly smaller, to the extent that religion is now only left with those things that science cannot yet explain. So it would be things like the origins of life, or how the universe began, or how it is that Liverpool have managed to lose 4 games in a row. Things like this are just completely inexplicable from science, and so people say, therefore, God must have done it. Of course, that would require you to believe that God was a Manchester United fan, which is a bit of a stretch. So this is essentially the relationship between religion and science seen from the conflict thesis, and these are some of the main themes that will come up in this particular debate. Now, it should be noted at this point that not everybody who subscribes to the conflict thesis is in the sort of new atheist approach. This idea is not just popular amongst people who don't like religion. There are quite a lot of people on the religious side who also subscribe to the conflict thesis, particularly fundamentalists, because they take the view that ultimately religion is going to win and science is going to be proven wrong. So they see it as this fight to the death, but they just take the view that science is ultimately going to be the loser. This guy, by the way, if you don't know who he is, I do recommend you go and look him up. This is Ken Ham, who runs an organisation called Ark Encounter in Kentucky. Behind him, you can see there a life-size model of Noah's Ark, and this organisation and Ken Ham, very, very fundamentalist, take the view that everything in the Bible is literally true, and therefore their worldview spans out from this. And so one of the things you'll discover if you go and look up Ken Ham, he's got quite a few videos on YouTube, is one of the things that comes up quite a lot, because he's quite famous for, is the story of Adam and Eve, because it's put to Ken Ham, of course, that, what happened with dinosaurs, right? Because that's not sort of mentioned in the Genesis account of how the universe and everything in it was created, and how does that relate to Adam and Eve? And so Ken Ham's view is that dinosaurs were around at the time of Adam and Eve, because obviously that's, if you follow the literal interpretation of the Bible, that's what you get. People then put to him, well, why weren't Adam and Eve eaten by the dinosaurs, right? We've all seen Jurassic Park. We all know sort of how this goes. T-Rex or something, Velociraptor would have come along. At some point, they'd have been in trouble. The answer to this from Ken Ham is that dinosaurs were vegetarian. So we had woke dinosaurs. Maybe they're vegan these days, I don't know. But then what happened after the fall, after all the stuff around, Eve eating the forbidden fruit of knowledge, that was when dinosaurs became meat-eating. And I'm saying this, I kid you not, go and, don't believe me, don't take my word for it, go and look up Ken Ham. This is how the fundamentalist mindset of this relationship between religion and science can get you into some very strange places. This creationist approach, this fundamentalist view, is also where you find arguments from design. And there are 2 basic varieties of this, which I'll rattle through them quite quickly. One is cosmological and one is biological, just in case you encounter any of these in the literature. The cosmological design argument says something like the various properties of the universe, things like the electromagnetic force and the strength of gravity and the nuclear force and all of these different mathematical things that you have to make a universe that doesn't just, after the Big Bang, completely fly off, right, but actually coagulates into matter and stuff, and ultimately stars and then carbon-based life forms. All of that would not have happened if any of the properties of the universe were even changed minutely, right? If the force of gravity was just slightly weaker, we wouldn't have this universe at all. Therefore, the argument goes, it's extraordinarily unlikely that this universe would have happened by itself, would have happened by random chance. Therefore, there must be a designer. And we get a similar case around biology. This is, by the way, where you have ideas of intelligent design, if you've ever heard of that. And the basic principle here is this idea of irreducible complexity. So the claim is something like this: a human eye, or an ear, or you can take any particular organ, only has a meaningful function if all of the parts are together at the same time. And so evolutionarily speaking, it makes absolutely no sense. You can't imagine how an eye would develop, because a retina on its own doesn't have any function beyond the other parts of the eye. So it all has to happen together at once or not at all. Irreducible complexity. You don't have things like half an eye in nature, or half a liver, right? Or half a nose, or things like this. And so the argument again is, these things wouldn't have arisen by random chance, therefore it needs a designer, therefore that designer has to be God. And so in both cases then, from the religious side and the non-religious side of this conflict thesis, the claim is that science and religion are completely incompatible, and ultimately one of them is going to lose. On the opposite side of this debate are a group of approaches that we can group together, I think, as they call them the harmony theses. And these tend to come in two different kinds. The first argues that science and religion are separate, they're independent of each other, so they don't clash because they have nothing to do, they live in different towns, right, so they don't meet up and fight. And then secondly, there is another couple of approaches which claim that they actually support each other. So they kind of become integrated in various different ways. So the first of these then, which is the more popular one, to be honest, is called the NOMA. And this stands for non-overlapping magisteria. This is described by Ian Barber, if you remember his models earlier on, as the independence model, but it's more commonly known as the NOMA after this guy here. You can see he was a paleontologist called Stephen Jay Gould, who popularised the idea. He said science and religion were non-overlapping magisteria. They explained different things in reality. They did not have any overlap between them, and because they didn't have any overlap between them, there was no tension between them, there was no conflict whatsoever, right? They were just completely separate spheres of human inquiry. As you can see in the quote here, the lack of conflict arises from a lack of overlap between their respective domains of professional expertise. Science operates in the empirical constitution of the universe. Religion is to do with the search for ethical values and the meaning of life. In other words, science explains how the world works in terms of the empirical material stuff and the physical laws of reality, whereas religion explains why the world is the way it is, talking about ethics, values, and meaning. And so this approach is quite popular. And one of the reasons I suspect it's quite popular, well, it's popular for obviously intellectual reasons, it's true, but I also think it's popular because it kind of ends the debate. And lots of people don't like to have this sort of debate, because if you go down the conflict thesis route, you're basically just arguing with people all the time, and it gets tiresome, and it's exhausting, and it's fractious. And people would much rather avoid conflict. And so I think a lot of people subscribe to the NOMA view, because it means that, you can it makes it easier for people to get along in life, which is generally, a good thing. Many theologians, many on the religious side, are also quite keen on this particular approach as well, because they worry what will happen if science does start to transgress into the religious domain. So they have this view that the two things are completely separate, but you can imagine, perhaps, I don't know if this is possible, but it's not beyond the realms of imagination, that science maybe at some point could discover how morality operates in the brain, could discover the physical laws and the cognitive properties that explain ethics and meaning and values, and then religion is potentially in trouble. So this way of looking at these two things is kind of set up, and they have a wall between them. And as I say, this is quite a popular view of this particular relationship. But people who worry about this tend to then subscribe to the other harmony approaches, which are basically the dialogue and the synthesis models. And these are not massively popular, so I'm not going to spend very long on them, but basically the dialogue approach argues that science and religion have common interests, and they have shared endeavour. And so they're not fighting each other, right? We're all human beings, and we've all got certain things in common. One, for example, is having a planet to live on. Right? So dealing with climate change is a problem that crosses all of these particular boundaries. And so people coming at it from the dialogue approach will say, these two sides can work together, they can learn from each other. Science can explain, the mechanisms of climate change and how it all works. And theologians can become involved in this debate because they would take the view that God gave humans stewardship over the earth, so humans have a responsibility to look after the earth from a theological viewpoint. Those two things kind of interlock in various different ways. So there's a mutual sort of respect between the two, and this is the best way to conceive of this relationship, in both intellectual and practical terms. The synthesis model goes a step further than this and argues that scientific and theological approaches can be interfused. They can be merged together. And a really good example of this is the idea of well-being. So there's lots of stuff now around well-being and meditation, for example, or that kind of, all of the well-being industry, which argues that there is a certain spiritual side to humanity, and recognizing that in the well-being area gets better results. So from this perspective, well-being has a spiritual dimension, but well-being also has a medical dimension, but those two things are not separate. Those two things actually go together. You can synthesize them. So the dialogue approach then becomes the synthesis approach, in which sees science and religion being basically two sides of the same thing. So those are the models. What then does the evidence tell us about them? And so to look at this, I'm going to quickly run through, first of all, the views of scientists, secondly, the views of the general public, and then thirdly, the role of religiosity, and there is a bit of overlap, by the way, between a couple of these, but we'll see how it goes. So this is basically how I'm going to explain the next couple of minutes. The first thing to note here, then, is that, looking at the views of scientists, most scientists tend to be non-religious, or at least less religious than the general population. It's even stronger, by the way, in the natural sciences, right? If you take the social sciences, not quite as strong, although it's still pretty strong. Natural sciences, it's much stronger. But nevertheless, scientists as a sort of general group of people, way less religious than the general population. Now, it is true that many scientists have been and are religious, like Galileo was religious, for example, Sir Francis Bacon was religious, Sir Isaac Newton was religious, Einstein comes up in these debates quite a lot. He was religious, although he was a deist. If you remember deism from last week, that was his view. And also there's a guy more recently called Francis Collins, who was, until I think 2008, the head of the Human Genome Project, which is the project designed to map out the human DNA, and is a staunch evangelical Christian. So when you look at scientists like this, they don't have any problem combining their particular viewpoints. So you can find scientists who are religious. However, certainly in the modern era, most scientists are definitely not. Here is some figures just to demonstrate this particular point. As you can see, this was from the United States in 2009, a survey by Pew, which found that belief in God in the general public, 81%. Belief in God amongst scientists, just 33%. And then when we sort of dug into it a bit and asked, scientists, are you non-religious? Now, of course, last week we were talking about this box called no religion and why it's, a big problem. But if you basically say, okay, if you're any of these things, atheist, agnostic, whatever, the general public in the United States, just 16%, amongst scientists, 48%. So scientists much less likely to be religious than the general population. And okay, there are a couple of things around this debate, by the way, because most of the evidence here comes from the United States. Not all of it, but most of it. And you could say, well, the United States has a particular culture around science and religion that shapes these things, and that's absolutely true. But it's not just the United States in this case. This was a study by Eklund et al., which looked at countries around the world. This was asking people if they identified as religious, and as you can see from this table, or this figure, the general population is the grey lines, and the scientists are the black lines, and the only countries where scientists were more religious than the general population were Taiwan and Hong Kong. In every other country, the general population was much more religious than scientists. However, Scientists are not a completely homogeneous, unified group, and there is no clear view on this particular issue. Here is a quote from the same study, which just makes the point that even though scientists may be less religious than the general population, this doesn't necessarily mean that they sign up to this conflict thesis relationship between the two sides. And from this particular quote, it just says, as you can see, scientists do not necessarily see the two sides being in conflict. Instead, they sign up to the non-overlapping magisteria approach. The second strand of evidence I want to quickly have a look at here concerns the general public, and this also shows that opinions are mixed. So on the one hand, there is support to show that there is some evidence for the conflict thesis. Again, we can go back to the United States. This is showing us views on evolution and whether human beings were created by God or whether human beings evolved in a completely naturalistic sense. The line at the bottom is the people who say that humanity evolved naturalistically. The line at the top says that human beings were created by God. And the one in the middle is evolution happened, but God kind of guided the process, which for this particular point is sort of less important, because what we're getting at with the top one and the bottom one, I mean, yeah, it's true that the top one peaked and then kind of fell away again, but it's still, by the end of that decade, 2019, hovered around 40%, which is an awful lot of people seeing no room for naturalistic processes in evolution. And then we've got about, just over a fifth of people on the other side. That looks quite conflicty to me. And surveys of the American public have also found, so this is quite interesting. They've also found that, so this also shows the conflict thesis, right? This is the starting point. Mostly in conflict, 50%, mostly compatible, 47%, right? So that looks like it's pretty much split down the middle. But what's really interesting about this, and I'm not quite sure how to explain it, is there is a link between this conflict thesis idea and levels of religiosity. And it doesn't work in the way that you would expect. Because you might think that people who had very high levels of religiosity, like fundamentalists, for example, would see the two sides being completely conflictual, and yet it goes the opposite way. Higher levels of religiosity, just over a third of people think it's conflictual, who I strongly suspect they are the fundamentalists, right? That's your fundamentalist group. And then the rest of them probably attend churches that have a more integrationist narrative. Or they, again, these questions are a bit difficult because it depends, as we know, well, how do you define religion? And how do you define science? So they may be defining all this stuff in very different ways. But anyway, by the time you get down to low levels of religiosity, much more likely to see the two sides being in conflict, which is strange and interesting. So the general public doesn't have a particularly settled view on this. And just to sort of underline that point, this is from a global study, again, from Pew, which was looking at countries in Eastern and Central Europe and asking people to the extent they thought religion and science were in conflict. And as you can see at the top, we've got Greece with 74%, Serbia, 73%. But by the time you get to the bottom, Latvia, 34%, Belarus, just 29%. So you get a whole range of public opinion on this. There is no particular settled view on the topic. And then finally, we have the role of religiosity itself. And again, this might not work, as I've just sort of intimated with the couple of slides ago, might not work in the way that you expect. In the United States, this was asking the clergy, right? So these were people who would stand up and preach at the weekend, people who ran churches, what their views of this relationship were. And it looks like that's a pretty good split, right? You've got 40% were pro-science, 29% were very anti-science, and then 31% quite liked science but were pretty critical of it. So what does that look like? To me, that sort of looks a bit like, it still looks a bit conflicty, because if you add up the critical of science and the anti-science, you get a sort of 60-40 split. So maybe that looks a bit conflicty. But again, this is one of those things where you might say this is being driven by the cultural situation in the United States, and where, there's a very sort of secular religious divide, particularly these days. But look what happens when you ask the same question, or at least very similar questions, to clergy in the UK. 51% favoured the integration model, 45% said they preferred the dialogue model, and less than 1% said they saw the two sides as being in conflict. That, to me, although I could just be completely, wildly off the mark here, that looks suspiciously low to me, and I strongly suspect there's, again, some kind of politics going on with this, right? Whereas in the United States, if you come out and say, I'm very strongly religious, I don't like science, there's quite a big constituency of people who would go along with that, right? Say that in the UK, you know, you probably get a job in reform, to be honest, probably be the Minister for Science in the next election. But apart from that, you know, the number of people who would subscribe to that view is likely to be very, very small. So maybe there's a certain amount of politics involved in this. I don't know. I just think that's a really interesting statistic, and it makes me wonder why it's so spectacularly small. So that's the case of the clergy. If you look at what grassroots believers show, and there's been, I'm not going to regale you with surveys and data and figures on this, but there's quite a lot of it. This is the general picture that you find. There is and again, there's kind of wobbles and nuances and all the rest of it, right? But the general picture, in terms of the grassroots religious individuals, in terms of their relationship to science, is that people who have higher levels of religiosity have more negative views towards science, they have less trust in scientific authorities, and they have lower levels of scientific knowledge. Then finally, on this particular point, well, I will come back to that particular theme in just a couple of minutes. This was from a study of 52 countries. This was by Esther Chan, and the figures here, this was looking at whether or not people trusted scientific authority and how that relationship worked according to religiosity. What this is basically showing you here is that the deeper the bars, so as we go towards the sort of right-hand side, that is the lowest levels of trust in religious authority. So we have here on the sort of left-hand side, there's a very small religiosity effect in countries like, you have to twist your head, Algeria and South Africa, but then by the time you get to the other side, the United States is in there somewhere, I can't see where it is, sixth from the right, Iraq, Turkey, Romania, there's a very, very strong link between religiosity and a lack of trust in science. So it does vary from place to place and from individual to individual, but there is nevertheless this general finding that's out there in the literature. One of the things that also comes up here, by the way, just before I move on, is that it's a general finding, but it does vary according to the issue at hand. So when people are considering, if you're speaking to religious individuals and you're asking them about the relationship between science and things that directly affect their theological worldview, like issues of abortion, for example, like, right to life, or how life is created, or if you're asking them about the age of the universe and things like this, much less likely to say they support science, because science in those areas directly conflicts with some of the central things in their theological worldview. If you're asking them things about, do you think your fridge is going to be working efficiently after 15 years, where science is involved in that, probably they're going to support the science on it, because whether or not your fridge works properly is not really something that affects your theological, day-to-day life. So it's stronger on certain issues than others, but nevertheless, it is a general trend. All of which brings me, in a very roundabout way, to the politics of all of this. Because everything I've kind of set out so far, you might be sort of sitting there thinking, well, okay, that's interesting or not, or it's what does it have to do with anything? How does this abstract debate, and who cares what people think about science and religion? What possible consequences does it have for anything? These are just people out there shouting at each other in the United States, generally, and, my day-to-day life is relatively unencumbered by the minutiae of this particular topic. Well, here's how it works, right? One important thing about this relationship is it's typically framed as an epistemological issue. Sorry to drag you back to PO 107 with all that stuff, right? Epistemology and ontology. But this is generally seen as an epistemological issue. In other words, it's about which side has the best way of explaining and understanding reality, which side has the best tools and processes for gaining knowledge and understanding about our world. And so that's how it's normally framed, which is, I'll come on to this in just a second, but that framing of this debate is something that typically comes from the New Atheist side, right? And a lot of the politics around this is about how religion is framed and how religion is set up in these particular debates. So when people talk about science and religion, that's normally what they mean. Which side is the best way of understanding reality? So it's not, I suppose what I want to say here is that the point is that it's not an intellectual exercise. It's not a neutral intellectual exercise, is a better way to put it. It's about, this debate is underscored and shot through with power relationships and power dynamics. So the New Atheists, for example, will say, they take a very, well, as you can see, take a very propositional view of religion. This is the view that religion is about beliefs, it's about the ideas that religion has about the world, and so if you frame religion in this way, if you say religion is about the beliefs that people have, and then you stack up those beliefs against science, it's no surprise then religion doesn't necessarily fare so well, because science has a better way of explaining the physical workings of the world than religion, which isn't really, it's not a cookbook for making reality, right? It's not designed to explain all these different points about protons and the laws of physics and everything else, right? So this framing of religion is designed to do particular things. And when you look at religion through the New Atheist viewpoint, when you see it as being propositional, you get people saying things like, so religion says that unscientific things happened, like Jesus came back from the dead, or miracles happened, things that break the known laws of physics. And then once you start to see religion in that light, it's no surprise then that science looks like it's coming out on top. Critics of this approach, on the other hand, claim that you shouldn't take religion literally. You shouldn't look at things like Genesis as being a literal description of how reality was put together. Instead, the argument is that holy text and religious cosmologies are understood metaphorical, or they're sort of allegories of the human experience. They're not designed to explain exactly how reality came into being. In fact, one of the things here is that, which is also, I think, quite interesting, the only people who really take religion literally are fundamentalists and the New Atheists. And so the New Atheists have this really kind of interesting mirror dynamic with the fundamentalists. They really hate the fundamentalists and they criticize the fundamentalists all the time. But in some respects, they're kind of the mirror opposite of them, in the sense that they both take the claims of religion to be literally true. And so supporters of this approach, this critical approach that says, no, religion is not a scientific hypothesis. Religion is not designed to explain how the laws of physics operate. It's about meaning, it's about values, it's about relationships, it's all that other stuff that Stephen Jay Gould would point towards, right, in the Noma. People like Karen Armstrong, for example, or Reza Aslan, you might have heard of him, or Tina Beattie, they will say that the problem with this debate is that science is being framed in a particular and a very negative way. And so what you have to do, or what you should do, is look at religion not as a propositional tool for understanding reality, but as about meaning and values and all of that kind of thing. So this is why this has day-to-day significance. Because if you look at religion as being a propositional statement about reality, if you look at religion as being a scientific hypothesis, like I say, it doesn't seem to stack up. Once you get to that point, you can then say, as the New Atheists do, that people who believe in religious claims must therefore be irrational. Right? It's irrational to believe in miracles when science has demonstrated that miracles don't happen and that the laws of physics are not broken in the ways that religion describes. So if we have a view of religion as being propositional, we can treat religion as a scientific hypothesis. If we treat religion as a scientific hypothesis, we can therefore get to a point where we say religious believers are irrational. If we get to a point where we can say religious believers are irrational, we can then get to a point where we say religious believers are dumb and stupid, because how can anybody believe this stuff? And it's therefore dangerous to believe this stuff, and therefore we get things like 9/11 and the Taliban and all this kind of religious violence and stupidity and cruelty in the world all comes from the same source. So this framing of religion in the conflict thesis, framing religion as propositional, framing it as a scientific hypothesis, is designed to undermine the public legitimacy of religion in day-to-day discourse. So it's quite political, is the point I'm making. This isn't just some abstract debate. The way in which, and this ties in again, as I'm sure you're already ahead of me on this, this ties into all of that stuff we were talking about a couple of weeks ago about how religion is defined and why it's important and why it's significant, right? And you can't just go, well, I mean, who cares about how religion is defined? We all kind of know what it is, etc., right? But actually, how religion is defined in public discourse has significant effects, and this is one of those effects. So that would be the sort of new atheist approach, right? On the other hand, if you come at it from the approach that says religion is not propositional, religion is about meaning and values and relationships, then you can frame religion as being a positive force for good in the world. And you can promote the idea that religion should maybe have a greater role in public life. I mean, we're seeing things, in France, for example, and I think Portugal yesterday, maybe the day before, voted to ban the veil as well. These are the kinds of things that you get from the sort of propositional view that sees religion as being irrational and all the rest of it. If we come at religion from the view of meaning and values and relationships, then we get a completely different approach towards religion, and then this can therefore lead to a worldview that says maybe we should be open to having a greater involvement for religion in society, politics, culture, and so on. So this is how the two sides of the debate, the sort of anti-religious side and the pro-religious side, this is how it filters down politically. And now I'm going to show you how this matters in terms of two concrete events. So two of the biggest things that have had and are still challenging the human race at the present time are climate change and the COVID pandemic. And this relationship between science and religion and the way in which the two sides were framed was very significant in A, how the COVID crisis panned out, and B, how the climate crisis might pan out. So it has pretty big political consequences. First of all, on the issue of climate change, there are some, again, nuances within this. There are some wobbles within this. Not every single study in this area is going to show you these results, but this is, again, the general picture that you find looking at studies into the relationship between religion and science in terms of the climate crisis. Most of this research, by the way, just to flag this up, has been conducted in the United States, which again does have a very particular culture going on, so it could be shaped by that, but nevertheless, this is all we have to go on. Research in this area has shown that there has been no real, there's this idea that religion would start to become more environmentally conscious, and it hasn't really happened, right? There is very little evidence of a greening effect within religion. Just to flag up a couple of things here, just in terms of the differences. So Buddhism tends to be much stronger on environmental issues. One of the weakest ones in the United States, I think, was Black Protestants. Tend to come out sort of at the bottom. Liberal Judaism, again, tends to come out at the top. I think one of the reasons why Black Protestants as a group come out pretty low on this is because Black Protestants more likely to belong to a disadvantaged group in society, much more likely to be economically disadvantaged, much more likely to have low-paying jobs, much less likely to be the kind of people with the disposable income and the time to care about whether or not the stuff they're buying from the shops is, organic or environmentally friendly, much too busy, working to try and pay the rent and everything else. So it's probably something to do with that. But anyway, the general approach here is that higher levels of religiosity are linked to having lower levels of concern for the environment, being less willing to change their day-to-day behaviour to deal with the climate crisis, much more likely surprise, surprise, to say that God controls events, therefore there's nothing really we can do about it anyway, so what's the point? It's all in God's hands, let's just carry on as we are and see what happens. And much less likely to be trustful of scientific authorities when they say things like, maybe we should cut down on our emissions and maybe we should change our own personal behaviour. So that's the general approach with religion and the climate crisis, and it's a similar thing for the literature on the pandemic and religion. And here we see, again, there was much less trust in scientific authorities, a higher belief in things like conspiracy theories. This was, Bill Gates was trying to track you in some way through the vaccine, or that the COVID was caused by 5G masts and stuff like this. So there was a higher incidence, a willingness to believe in conspiracy theories, being much less likely to follow safety guidelines, much more likely to put trust in the power of faith, and much less likely to obtain a vaccine. Here are some figures on this. Again, this is from the United States. But as you can see here, the highest group, which is third from bottom, was the self-identified atheists. 90% of self-identified atheists at the time this survey was taken had obtained a COVID vaccine. The smallest group, second from the top, white evangelicals, with just 57%. International research here has also found higher links between religion and death rates during the pandemic, and one of the vectors here was that religious communities were much less likely to follow the safety guidelines, and much more likely, in particular, to stick to their religious communities and attending places of worship, right? Much less likely to say, I'm not going to church this week because there's a COVID crisis on, I'm still going to go. There was a church in South Korea, I think this is pronounced the Shinjonji Church. I might have just completely murdered that, but I think that's it. This single church in South Korea was responsible for 5,000 cases. South Korea was ultra hot on dealing with the pandemic, right? Ultra hot on tracking. They had probably the best tracking system in the world. And at that particular time, when this church produced these 5,000 cases, that was half of all the cases of COVID-19 in the entire country. But there's been other studies as well demonstrating these sort of community effects in the Netherlands, for example, Germany, again, people much more likely to stay within their own communities and to move around in their own communities for religious reasons, and therefore spread COVID. And because these communities were much more likely to pass COVID on, they also tended to have higher death rates. So religious communities had higher incidences of contracting and dying from COVID than the non-religious population. So how does this then, in the final sort of 2 minutes, break down politically? Well, for the people who argue on the anti-religious side, on the new atheist side, they will look at things like this and say religion is clearly a problem in these cases, right? Religion was clearly one of the reasons, or a reason why COVID was worse than it had to be. And if you look at figures in the United States as well, by the way, you'll see the more religious states had way higher death rates than the lower religious states, right? There was a clear religious dimension to how the pandemic operated. And so from the anti-religious viewpoint, the argument here would be religion was part of the problem. Religion made the pandemic worse because it had an anti-scientific ethos. Similarly, in terms of the climate crisis, the argument would be religion is making it worse because religious individuals are not taking science seriously, they're putting too much emphasis on faith, refusing to change their behaviour, and we are all quite literally going to hell in a handcart. The more pro-religious side of this, however, will say religion is part of the solution, because religious leaders, religious authorities have quite a big influence over their communities. And if a senior religious figure stands up and says, the pandemic is serious, you need to follow the safety guidelines, or the climate crisis is serious, we need to be doing more, that is a very effective vehicle for promoting and expanding the pro-green message that we need to kind of increasingly take up to have a chance of of beating the problem. So the anti-religious view then will say religion is one of the reasons why everything's so bad and is a big part of the problem. The pro-religious view will say actually it's part of the solution. We need more religion, not less religion in these types of situations. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it for today. As ever, thanks for coming. Next week, we're going to be talking about the links between religion and morality, but that is it for today.